From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
What is SWIFT? What is the SWIFT banking system? I mean, let's be honest. Money makes the world go round, right? As the conflict in Eastern Europe continues, collectively, we saw actions that we had predicted would come to pass in earlier episodes. And this is the kind of show where it's not always good news when we're correct. We were right about sanctions. We were so far correct about context. Look, NATO, the U.S., and other forces went pretty hard on the sanction paint. They drove Russia's already struggling domestic economy into a tailspin. Not a lot of people are investing in rubles. Recently, the global public learned of this other type of economic warfare, and it's something people outside of the world of geopolitics and finance hadn't really heard of. It's SWIFT. It's an acronym. It's a big deal. Long story short, in retaliation for the invasion of Ukraine, Russia just got kicked out of this thing called SWIFT. But what is it? Why does it matter? And perhaps more importantly, why were some European countries so hesitant to pull the plug? Here are the facts. If we want to talk about SWIFT, we have to talk about international banking. Everybody drink some coffee. We got to stay awake for this one. So a lot of people, including ourselves, heard about sanctions against Russia. Like anything in geopolitics, sanctions are not particularly new, and they are very much not easily lifted. Uncle Sam, for instance, is still salty at Cuba and has had embargoes and sanctions on that island nation for many decades now. What happened with sanctions recently is that the West was deploying further sanctions against Russia because they had already done so under previous world leadership. But they started describing something as a nuclear option, quote unquote. And the nuclear option was the sanction that is very difficult to walk back, which was kicking them out of the sphere of international banking. Globally connected finance networks are, in a very real way, love it or hate it, the backbone of modern civilization.
Maybe not the best term to just throw around, the nuclear option, being that there is, in fact, an actual nuclear option. Just putting that
Which
out.
is also being mentioned.
Back on that enormous table, or one of the enormous tables that Vladimir Putin
That massive
enjoys.
boardroom table with 100 feet separating Putin from his shivering toadies.
And to be candid, this is still hopefully a distant possibility. I think if I had to guess, I think the first foray would be something like a quote unquote nuclear test. But Russian forces have invaded, and they are occupying Chernobyl as we speak. So, so the West the global West and the innocent people of Ukraine, and honestly, the innocent citizens of Russia are very worried about this stuff. But let's go back to the banking thing. So it's boring, and it's kind of a feature, not a bug. You know, it's good to those in power for banking to be a snooze fest. But it's weird if you think about it. Imagine, out of all the things that countries always fight about throughout history to the present day, there's one thing they could all finally agree on, and it was so lame. They all got together and said, "We need ways to move money." All right, ideology aside, guys, you know, cultural whatnots and whataboutisms aside, we got tabs to pay, right? That is what SWIFT comes from. Like, think about this. Like, when's the last time, Matt, Noel, when's the last time any of us sent a physical check? I bet we remember because I bet it's rare.
I mean, it was so rare that I think I had to go to the bank and get like a counter check because I don't have a checkbook to my name. I just don't.
Well, I actually have several checkbooks in here, guys.
You got any Superman ones? Are they bespoke?
No,
Are they
they're
burger
not.
accounts?
No. No. It's just the old accounts that I've had. I've had the same account, and it's just changed banks as bigger banks keep consuming the smaller ones. But I did use one not long ago, and it was just to pay a company that came over to the house to help me with some repairs. And it's a weird thing because then you have to wait for everything to occur before you get confirmation from your own bank that money has actually changed hands. And then, I don't know, it becomes a strange thing. We're so used to having immediate transfers when we're banking online in some way or just using, an app or something. I think we've become so accustomed to that. And we as consumers, but banks have also become very much accustomed to that.
Well, who does use checks still is Uncle Sam. I think the most often I handle a check is when I get a refund from the government. But now those, obviously those can be done direct deposit as well. But it's interesting, like, checks seem so antiquated, but like there are machines at grocery stores, for example, where I think still some older folks do use checks where they scan them through and it scans that barcode, and it does happen more quickly, almost the same rate, I believe, as a debit transaction.
The global consumer, from the individual to the state level actor, is pretty much on board with the old Jay-Z line. I got no passion, I got no patience, and I hate waiting. So, like, imagine living your life without electronic access to money. It is possible, but it is increasingly impractical in the modern day. I mean, think about it. And a lot of people do think about this. What if you could only handle those physical representations of money in specific amounts? You can only write the check. You have to wait for the check to clear. You can only use cold hard cash. Or back in earlier days, you can only use whatever weird thing is the physical currency of your community, right? Like, people talk about gold and the gold standard. Humans have been using crazy stuff as currency, as representations of wealth for such a long time. Peppercorns, big rocks. That's a true story. There was a community that used big rocks as money, and I'm only laughing at that because I also laugh at the idea of the dollar. And now, as we're increasingly moving toward abstract representations of value and wealth, money, by the way, is only an equation of labor over time, basically. And that's an apolitical observation. What we see is, like, when I'm asking when's the last time we touched a physical check, it sounds like for most people it is not necessarily a normal occurrence, right? The most normal occurrence is to, at least in the US, is to receive a check, like you said, Noel, from maybe a state or federal entity. It's
perhaps
relatively
an overpayment on a credit card or something like that. They'll issue you a check for like $8 and send it to you.
And you guys know I love culture jamming and I love being a problem. I have at least one credit card that I continually have a zero balance, and every so often I just pay them $5 because I know eventually they're going to have to waste time and effort sending me that $5 back. It's weird. I'm not saying I'm a good person. I'm not saying I'm a good person by any means, but I like the culture jamming. I like the asymmetric warfare of it. So for a lot of folks, especially our younger conspiracy realists, it may be difficult to remember the last time you wrote a physical check. You may be thinking of one of your elders in your family, or you may be thinking of your parents making a big purchase, right? Like a house or a car, etc. Surprise, surprise, the system is not that different at the top. People don't like waiting. They have no passion. They have no patience. This is where something called the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication comes into play. Street name, SWIFT. Cool name. What is it? It talks with so much money. Planet Money put it really well. NPR podcast, where they called it a WhatsApp, or as you pointed out off air, Matt, a signal communication platform for banks. It's going to surprise a lot of people to realize that SWIFT itself is not a government entity. It is not, a body of the United Nations, nor is it a body of NATO, nor is it a body of the European Union. It's essentially a ton of countries and private banks that got together in May of 1973 and said, we got to team up. And they rose in response to problems before SWIFT came into play. And we'll explain a little bit more about what SWIFT is. Before it came into play, international financial transactions from individuals, from institutions, from countries, any of those entities communicating together, those usually took place over a thing called Telex. And talk about feeling old. Telex is a precursor to something that's also antiquated nowadays, the fax machine. Remember, guys, in our old office, we had a fax machine, and it was just it was such a pain in the keister to use it.
Well, not only that, just occasionally it'll just make that crazy modem sound. It's interesting. Ben, you and I were hanging last night and talking about just the very interesting history of data transfer, and like how ultimately we still use a lot of technologies that are very lo-fi, like encoded within that sound is the data. That is the sound of the data, like going through the line that's being interpreted by the other side. It's all in a sound. And that's essentially what Telex was doing. But again, even more lo-fi. It was a precursor to the fax machine. If we can imagine what that would be like, as antiquated as the fax machine seems.
Yeah. So Telex is essentially communicating via telephone lines. You know what I mean? It's a descendant in some ways of the telegraph, right? It's in the name. But the issue with Telex was that it was controlled in a way such that European countries and banks were increasingly concerned that a private entity, heaven forfend, God forbid, an American private entity, might control the global flow of money. This was based in the actions of an outfit called First National City Bank. You know it today as Citibank, with spelled C-I-T-I, so it sounds less dangerous.
It's quirky.
Mm-hmm. And the Europeans, the old money, thought that this bank was getting a little too big for its Yankee britches. They also, I don't want to ding the Europeans here, they also had a really valid point with this concern. And it's a fascinating thing. So Telex senders had to transcribe every transaction. They had to write it out in sentences by hand. And then those sentences had to be interpreted and then executed by the person on the other end of the, the can and string line that is Telex. What this meant is that it led to, and this is so interesting, I think I'm supposed to say it led to a lot of errors, and it had slower processing time. But when we're talking about errors, what we're really talking about is corruption, often on the part of the powerful. People who are powerful enough to get away with one of those old Dave Chappelle, "I'm sorry, officer, I didn't know I couldn't do that" kind of things in court. So so it is, I am certain that several financial shenanigans that were premeditated and purposeful, executed via Telex, were later sort of dropped down to just Bob Ross happy accidents, right? And those people didn't go to jail. Anyhow, so the Europeans have real concerns. SWIFT wins the day. It is a co-op. It is not a government body. It is, as we speak, the current global standard for financial messaging. We don't have to get too into the weeds, but we should describe a bit about how this mechanism works. What do we say what do we mean when we say it's like Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp for banks? What do we mean? What does that all mean?
Well, I mean, it's a messaging system, but it's not just going between, different countries, different languages. It's going between currencies. You can make exchanges of all different sorts. Really, think of one, you can exchange it through SWIFT if you are a member financial institution. I mean, you think about it this way. If you imagine all of the transactions that occur, maybe automated payments that happen from your bank account, or credit card payments, little things you buy during a day, if you're going to get lunch or something, you've got a certain number of transactions that are occurring. Now imagine that on like a countrywide scale, or an entire bank, or just think about any bank, whichever one you use. There are billions of transactions occurring across the world that go through SWIFT, and it's
every single day.
Yeah, every day, every moment, it's just happening. Money is just transferring all over the planet, and SWIFT is the thing that's carrying that. It's the jet stream that all of those transactions are flying through across the world.